Candlelight trembled in long golden rows beneath the towering chandeliers of Harrington House, illuminating a sea of silk gowns and polished boots that moved in elegant patterns across the ballroom floor. The air carried the scent of roses, beeswax, and expensive perfume, mingling with the soft music of violins that floated like a dream through the glittering chamber. It was the height of the London season, the sort of evening where fortunes were made, alliances forged, and reputations quietly destroyed with nothing more than a whisper behind a fan. Miss Eleanor Whitmore entered the ballroom as though stepping onto a stage already prepared for her downfall. She felt the change immediately, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Conversations faltered. Fans lifted slightly higher. Eyes flickered toward her and away again, like moths startled by a flame. Once, not long ago, Eleanor had walked into gatherings like this with a light heart and the easy confidence of a young woman admired for both her grace and intelligence. Tonight, admiration had turned into something colder, curiosity sharpened by rumor. Her pale blue gown was modestly cut, its satin skirts whispering against the polished marble floor as she moved forward. The gown had been chosen carefully, neither ostentatious nor timid, but it did little to protect her from the glances that followed in her wake. A quiet murmur rose from a cluster of ladies near the far wall, their jeweled hairpins glittering beneath the candlelight. Is that truly her? So unfortunate. They say he discovered everything only days before the wedding. Eleanor kept her chin lifted, though each word drifted through the ballroom like frost settling upon her skin. The collapse of her engagement had happened scarcely a fortnight ago, yet already society had reshaped the story into something scandalous and irresistible. The orchestra shifted into a waltz. Couples flowed onto the dance floor, skirts swirling like soft clouds as polished shoes glided in perfect rhythm. Eleanor remained near the edge of the room, her gloved hands clasped lightly before her as though she were merely pausing to admire the music. In truth, she was gathering the fragile threads of her composure. Across the ballroom, a gentleman watched her. Mr. Julian Crawford stood among a circle of laughing acquaintances, his tall figure immaculate in black evening dress. His dark hair was perfectly arranged, his posture relaxed, his smile charming enough to melt the skepticism of nearly any observer. Nearly any observer except Eleanor. For beneath that smile lay the man she had come to know far too well. Their eyes met across the room. Julian lifted his glass slightly in a gesture that appeared almost affectionate to those watching. Yet Eleanor recognized the gleam in his gaze, the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed himself firmly in control of the narrative. He began to walk toward her. Each step seemed unhurried, almost casual, yet Eleanor felt the air tighten with his approach. Guests shifted subtly aside to make space for him, as though the ballroom itself acknowledged his confidence. When he reached her, he bowed with impeccable politeness. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly, "how courageous of you to attend this evening." His voice was low enough that only she could hear the mockery threaded through it. Eleanor inclined her head with careful restraint. "Good evening, Mr. Crawford." To anyone observing, the exchange would appear perfectly civil. Only the faint tightening of Eleanor's fingers betrayed the storm gathering beneath her calm expression. Julian leaned slightly closer, his voice soft and intimate. "London is speaking of little else," he murmured. "Your disappearance from our engagement has produced a remarkable amount of speculation." "I imagine it has," Eleanor replied quietly. His smile widened, though it held no warmth. "One might think," he continued, "that a lady would wish to correct certain misunderstandings." The implication hung between them like a blade. Eleanor knew precisely what he meant. Julian had been carefully shaping society's version of events, suggesting that she had abandoned him without explanation, that she possessed secrets too delicate to discuss openly. In truth, she had ended their engagement after discovering the debts he had concealed, the reckless gambling that threatened to swallow her inheritance the moment they were married. But exposing him would have required public accusations, and Eleanor had hesitated. She had believed silence the more dignified path. Julian had used that silence brilliantly. Now the whispers painted her as impulsive, unstable, perhaps even deceitful. Julian's gaze flicked toward the dancers circling the floor. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I still possess certain letters you once wrote me." Eleanor's breath caught. Private letters written during the hopeful months of their courtship. Words of affection that could easily be twisted into something compromising if revealed to the wrong audience. "I should hate," Julian added softly, "for them to be misunderstood." The ballroom suddenly felt too warm, the candlelight glaring against Eleanor's vision. "You would not," she said quietly. Julian studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost sympathetic shrug. "Society has a curious appetite for drama," he replied. "And I do so dislike disappointing my audience." Across the room, laughter erupted as a group of dancers spun past in glittering circles. To them, the evening remained a carefree celebration. For Eleanor, the wall seemed to close in. She realized with chilling clarity that Julian had no intention of allowing her dignity to survive this season. He bowed again with perfect elegance. "Do enjoy the remainder of the evening, Miss Whitmore." Then he turned away, leaving her standing amid the music and candlelight. Eleanor remained motionless for several seconds, her pulse hammering wildly. Around her, conversations resumed in quiet waves. A pair of ladies glanced in her direction and whispered behind delicate ivory fans. The humiliation pressed against her chest like a tightening cage. Without quite deciding to do so, Eleanor began to walk. She moved quickly through the ballroom, past the dancing couples and the glittering chandeliers, past the curious glances that followed her retreat. The terrace doors stood open to the cool night air, but instead of stepping outside, she slipped into a quieter corridor beyond the main hall. The music faded behind her. The corridor was dimly lit by a single row of lamps, their soft glow reflecting against dark paneled walls. Eleanor's breath came faster now, her composure finally cracking beneath the weight of Julian's threat. If he revealed those letters, her reputation would not merely suffer, it would be destroyed. She turned a corner and continued down the passage, desperate for a moment of privacy in which to steady herself. Several doors lined the hallway, most closed, their brass handles gleaming faintly in the lamplight. One door stood slightly open. Eleanor barely paused before slipping inside. The room beyond was warm, lit by the steady glow of a fireplace. Heavy curtains framed a tall window, and a large bed stood against the far wall draped in deep burgundy velvet. A bedchamber. The realization struck her just as the door clicked softly behind her. She turned and froze. Near the fireplace stood a tall gentleman she had not noticed upon entering. His broad shoulders were outlined by the flickering firelight, his posture still as stone as he regarded her sudden appearance. The Duke of Ashbourne. For a long heartbeat neither of them spoke. Eleanor's mortification was complete. Of all the rooms in this vast house, she had stumbled into the private chamber of one of the most powerful men in England. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she managed breathlessly. "I did not realize." The words faltered as a new sound reached them both. From the corridor beyond the door came the unmistakable click of approaching footsteps, and the slow, deliberate turn of the handle. The sound of the turning handle sliced through the silence like a blade, and Eleanor Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face. For a suspended instant she could neither breathe nor move. The Duke of Ashbourne stood several paces away beside the hearth, his tall figure outlined by the amber glow of the fire, his expression unreadable as he listened to the faint metallic scrape of the latch. In the next moment the door would open, and whoever stood in the corridor would discover a young lady alone in a gentleman's bedchamber. In London society there were mistakes one could explain, and there were mistakes that could never be undone. Eleanor's instinct was to flee, yet there was nowhere to go. The room contained no second exit, only heavy curtains, polished furniture, and the large velvet-draped bed that seemed to proclaim her disgrace even before it happened. She pressed one trembling hand against her bodice as the handle turned further. Then the Duke moved. He crossed the room with swift, silent authority and caught Eleanor gently by the wrist. His touch was firm but not rough, his gloved fingers cool against her pulse. Without speaking, he guided her behind a tall folding screen positioned near the far wall. The carved wood panels were inlaid with pale silk that muffled the glow of the firelight, creating a narrow pocket of shadow. "Remain still," murmured quietly. The words were calm, measured, almost reassuring. Eleanor scarcely had time to comprehend the command before the door opened. Two gentlemen entered the chamber with the careless ease of men who believed themselves entirely alone. Their laughter carried across the room, bright and unguarded. "I tell you," one said, "Harrington has outdone himself this season." "Indeed," replied the other, "half the eligible ladies in London are under this roof tonight. One must admire such efficiency." They moved toward the hearth, unaware of the silent figures concealed only a few feet away. Eleanor felt the Duke's presence beside her, close enough that she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing. Her heart hammered wildly, certain the sound must echo through the screen. If the gentleman chose to step a few paces farther, the thought tightened her chest. Instead they paused near the fireplace, warming their hands as they continued their cheerful conversation. They spoke of horse races and parliamentary gossip, of wagers and flirtations, the trivial concerns of men who had never known the precarious edge upon which a woman's reputation balanced. Minutes stretched painfully. Eleanor remained motionless, scarcely daring to shift her weight. The Duke did not release her wrist, though his grip softened slightly as if to reassure her that panic was unnecessary. At last one of the visitors sighed. "We ought to return before the next set begins," he said. "Quite right. Lady Hawthorne promised me a dance." Their footsteps crossed the carpet once more. The door opened, then closed behind them with a gentle click. Silence returned. For several seconds neither Eleanor nor the Duke moved. The room seemed strangely smaller now, the air thick with the tension of what had nearly occurred. The Duke released her wrist and stepped back. "You may come out, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor emerged slowly from behind the screen, her composure still fragile. The firelight revealed his features clearly for the first time. Dark hair brushed neatly back, a strong jaw shadowed faintly by evening stubble, and eyes so steady they seemed almost unnerving. Alexander Hawthorne, Duke of Ashbourne, possessed a reputation as formidable as his title. He was known for a reserved manner that bordered on icy detachment, a man who attended society gatherings only when necessity demanded it and spoke little when he did. Yet the man before her appeared neither irritated nor amused, only attentive. "I cannot adequately express my apology, Your Grace," Eleanor said at last. "I entered without realizing the room was occupied." The Duke regarded her thoughtfully for a moment before replying. "Panic seldom leads us to accurate observations." His voice was low, resonant, carrying a calm authority that seemed to quiet the last of her racing thoughts. Eleanor drew a careful breath. "You must believe me when I say I had no intention of intruding." "I do believe you," he said simply. The ease of the answer startled her. Most gentlemen would have questioned her motives or dismissed her explanation entirely. Society had already branded her impulsive and unpredictable. The Duke, however, seemed uninterested in repeating that judgment. He crossed the room and poured a small glass of water from a crystal decanter resting upon the sideboard. When he offered it to her, his expression remained composed. "You appear in need of this." Eleanor accepted the glass with quiet gratitude, aware that her hands were still unsteady. The cool water steadied her breathing. "You have spared me from a terrible misunderstanding," she said softly. Ashbourne's gaze held hers for a moment. "Society specializes in misunderstandings," he replied, "particularly when a woman's reputation is involved." The remark carried a faint edge of irony that surprised her. "You are familiar with the situation surrounding me, then?" "In London," he said, "it is difficult not to be." A faint flush warmed Eleanor's cheeks. "I suppose the rumors are quite entertaining." "They are persistent," he corrected. She lowered her eyes briefly, gathering what dignity remained. The truth rarely travels as quickly as scandal. Ashbourne studied her in silence, as though measuring the sincerity of her words. At length he spoke again. "You left the ballroom rather abruptly." "Yes." "And Mr. Crawford followed you?" Eleanor's gaze lifted sharply. "You noticed that?" "I noticed many things." His tone was neither boastful nor accusing, merely factual. For a moment she considered denying it. Yet something in his steady expression encouraged honesty. "He wished to remind me that he still possesses certain letters," she admitted quietly. Ashbourne's brows drew together slightly. "Private correspondence?" "Yes." The Duke turned toward the fire, his profile thoughtful in the shifting light. "Then Mr. Crawford has placed you in a delicate position. That is one way to describe it." Eleanor attempted a small smile, though it held little humor. The events of the evening seemed suddenly overwhelming, the whispers, Julian's veiled threat, the near catastrophe behind the screen. "I had hoped attending tonight might prove I was not hiding from society," she confessed. "Instead it appears I have simply provided it with new material." Ashbourne's gaze returned to her. "You underestimate society's imagination," he said quietly. Eleanor could not help letting out a soft breath of weary amusement. "Perhaps I do." For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting shifting shadows across the room. Then the Duke asked a question that caught her completely off guard. "Would you return to the ballroom if given a reason to do so?" Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon." Ashbourne's expression remained calm, yet there was a spark of quiet resolve in his eyes. "You entered that room alone," he said, "and every whisper will assume the worst if you remain absent much longer." A faint unease stirred within her. What reason could possibly change that? The Duke stepped toward the door. Then he looked back at her. "The sort of reason," he said, "that ensures no one dares question your presence again." And with that quiet declaration, the Duke of Ashbourne opened the door and gestured for her to follow him back into the light. The corridor beyond the Duke's chamber felt colder than Eleanor remembered, as though the quiet walls themselves carried whispers waiting to awaken. Alexander Hawthorne walked beside her with unhurried composure, his tall frame moving with a confidence that seemed entirely indifferent to the risks she felt pressing against her ribs. Eleanor struggled to match his calm stride, though her thoughts raced wildly. Returning to the ballroom meant returning to Julian Crawford's watchful eyes, to the murmurs of the ton, and to the fragile reputation already trembling beneath the weight of rumor. They reached the doors leading back into the great hall. Through the carved panels drifted the music of the orchestra and the gentle roar of fashionable conversation. Eleanor hesitated. The Duke noticed immediately. "You may still withdraw," he said quietly. "No one need know you were here." Eleanor studied his face, searching for mockery yet found none. His expression held only a measured steadiness that suggested the choice was truly hers. "If I leave," she said softly, "the whispers will simply grow louder tomorrow." Ashbourne inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging her courage. "Then we shall ensure tonight's whispers favor you instead." Before Eleanor could question the meaning of his remark, he pushed open the doors. The ballroom unfolded before them in a blaze of candlelight and color. Music swelled from the orchestra as couples turned gracefully across the polished floor. Laughter floated above the crowd like drifting ribbons of sound. And then the room noticed them. Conversation faltered in ripples, one circle of guests after another turning toward the entrance where the Duke of Ashbourne now stood beside Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Few sights could command greater attention. The Duke rarely lingered at social gatherings, and when he did he kept himself distant from the swirl of courtship and gossip. To see him escorting the very woman currently whispered about across London was enough to stir every curious eye in the room. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. The same glances that had earlier carried pity now sharpened into startled interest. Ashbourne guided her calmly toward the dance floor. "Your Grace," she murmured under her breath, "this is hardly necessary." "On the contrary," he replied. "It is precisely necessary." The orchestra finished the final measure of a waltz. Applause rippled through the room as dancers stepped apart. Then Ashbourne bowed before her. "Miss Whitmore," he said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "may I have the honor of this dance?" The silence around them deepened. Several ladies stared openly, their fans forgotten in their hands. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Declining him would only create further spectacle. Accepting meant stepping directly into the center of society's gaze. Slowly she placed her gloved hand in his. "I would be honored, Your Grace." The orchestra began again. Ashbourne led her into the waltz with effortless confidence, his hand steady at her waist as they joined the turning circle of dancers. Eleanor concentrated on the rhythm of the steps, grateful that the graceful pattern required little conversation. Yet she could feel the attention of the entire ballroom. Every turn carried them past curious faces and whispering clusters of guests. The story unfolding before them was far more captivating than any rumor whispered earlier in the evening. "You are remarkably composed," the Duke said quietly as they glided past a row of watching gentlemen. "I assure you appearances are misleading," Eleanor replied. A faint glimmer of amusement touched his expression. "I suspected as much." For several moments they danced in silence, the music rising and falling around them. Eleanor gradually realized something unexpected. The humiliation she had felt earlier seemed to recede beneath the steady assurance of the Duke's presence. He did not treat her as a woman to be pitied, nor as one to be avoided. Instead he danced with the quiet certainty of a man who saw no reason to question her worth. Across the room Eleanor glimpsed Julian Crawford. He stood near the edge of the floor, his charming smile frozen into something tighter as he watched the dance unfold. The glass in his hand caught the candlelight, reflecting a flash of irritation in his eyes. Eleanor felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. The music carried them through another turn. "Your former fiancé appears displeased," Ashbourne observed calmly. "He dislikes losing control of a narrative," Eleanor replied. Ashbourne considered that. Control is an illusion most people guard fiercely. Their eyes met briefly before the dance swept them apart again. The moment lingered longer than it should have. At last the waltz ended. Ashbourne escorted her from the floor, guiding her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the gardens. The cool night air slipped through the slightly open panes, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant roses. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for the dance. For restoring a measure of dignity to an evening determined to remove it." Ashbourne leaned lightly against the marble ledge of the window. "I suspect your dignity required very little assistance." Eleanor studied him thoughtfully. His reputation had painted him as cold, aloof, almost indifferent to society's dramas. Yet the man beside her possessed a quiet attentiveness that contradicted every rumor she had heard. "Why did you help me?" she asked at last. Ashbourne's gaze drifted briefly across the ballroom before returning to her. "Because the story being told about you is incomplete." "That is a generous interpretation." "Perhaps," he said. "But generosity is occasionally mistaken for fairness." Before Eleanor could respond, a servant approached carrying a small silver tray. Upon it rested a velvet box sealed with the Duke's crest. Ashbourne took the box without explanation. "This arrived earlier this evening," he said, offering it to her. Eleanor stared in surprise. "For me?" "For you." Her pulse quickened as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a delicate silver brooch shaped like a lily, its petals finely etched and luminous beneath the candlelight. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "A symbol," Ashbourne said quietly. "Of what?" "Of the fact that even in muddy water, a lily remains untouched." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in Eleanor's chest. Across the room Julian Crawford watched the exchange, his expression darkening as Eleanor closed the velvet box around the silver lily. And in that silent moment, he began planning the scandal that would destroy them both. The days that followed the Harrington ball moved with the deceptive calm that often settles before a storm. London society, restless and endlessly curious, had found a new story to savor. Wherever Eleanor Whitmore appeared, whispers stirred like wind through tall grass. Yet those whispers had changed in tone. What had once carried pity and quiet judgment now held intrigue, for the Duke of Ashbourne had placed himself unmistakably at the center of the narrative. It was impossible to ignore such a gesture. A duke did not casually single out a woman whose reputation had been bruised by scandal, not in full view of the most watchful eyes in the capital. The dance they had shared beneath the chandeliers had already begun transforming into legend, embroidered with speculation and romantic invention in drawing rooms across Mayfair. Eleanor felt the weight of that attention every time she stepped into society again. Yet the silver lily brooch rested against her gown like a small promise of steadiness. Its cool metal reminded her of the quiet certainty in Ashbourne's voice when he had spoken of fairness. And strangely she saw him again. Not by accident as some would have assumed. Their meetings unfolded with an almost understated inevitability. At a concert in Hanover Square he greeted her with a respectful bow and asked about the music rather than the rumors surrounding her. At a gallery exhibition he stood beside her before a painting of storm-dark seas and spoke of patience rather than gossip. Each encounter was brief, measured, entirely proper, yet Eleanor felt something shifting in the spaces between those conversations. Ashbourne listened when she spoke. Not politely, not distantly, but with a deliberate attentiveness that made every word feel considered. Gradually Eleanor began to understand why society regarded him with both admiration and unease. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man who observed everything while revealing very little. One afternoon, beneath the pale autumn sunlight of Hyde Park, he joined her carriage as she prepared to depart from a promenade crowded with fashionable riders and strolling families. The park glowed with soft gold light, leaves stirring gently along the gravel paths. "You appear thoughtful, Miss Whitmore," he remarked as the carriage rolled slowly past the lake. "That is a charitable description," Eleanor replied lightly. "Most would say I appear watched." Ashbourne's gaze shifted briefly toward the distant figures walking along the path. "London observes everything," he said. "But observation does not always produce understanding." Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. "Your Grace, I hope you do not regret assisting me that evening." The Duke's brow lifted slightly. "Do you?" "No." The answer came more quickly than she expected. Ashbourne studied her with quiet interest. "Then we are in agreement." Yet Eleanor knew their association carried risks, perhaps greater ones than either of them openly acknowledged. Julian Crawford had not vanished quietly from society. His presence lingered like a shadow just beyond the edge of every gathering she attended. And shadows had a habit of waiting. The confrontation came 3 weeks later at the Winter Assembly Ball, an event so grand it seemed to gather the entire aristocracy of London beneath a single glittering roof. Crystal chandeliers blazed above polished marble floors, and the air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the rustle of silk gowns sweeping through crowded corridors. Eleanor entered the ballroom with calm determination. The silver lily brooch shimmered faintly at her shoulder. For a time the evening passed without incident. She danced once with an old family acquaintance and spoke politely with a group of ladies near the refreshment table. Yet beneath the surface of the festivities she sensed something gathering, like the tension before thunder. Julian Crawford stood near the center of the room. His dark hair was immaculate, his posture confident, his smile charming enough to draw curious listeners close. Eleanor watched from across the ballroom as he spoke animatedly with several gentlemen whose attention sharpened with each word he offered. Then Julian's gaze lifted. Their eyes met. The smile on his lips widened slowly, deliberately, as though the moment had been carefully arranged. He crossed the ballroom toward her. Conversations faltered as he approached, the subtle ripple of anticipation spreading through nearby guests. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Society loved spectacle, and Julian Crawford had always possessed a talent for theatrics. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly, stopping before her. "Mr. Crawford." His voice carried just loudly enough to reach the curious ears gathering nearby. "I believe," he continued, "that certain matters between us have remained unresolved." Eleanor's spine straightened. "I cannot imagine what you mean." Julian chuckled softly. "Your modesty is admirable. Yet I fear the circumstances are rather difficult to ignore." A hush began spreading through the surrounding crowd. "I speak," he continued, "of the curious evening at Harrington House. The evening when Miss Whitmore vanished from the ballroom and was later discovered in a gentleman's private chamber." Gasps rippled outward like falling stones in water. Eleanor felt heat rise sharply to her cheeks. Julian turned slowly toward the gathering audience. "I believe the gentleman in question was none other than His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne." The name carried across the room like a struck bell. Guests shifted, murmuring, their eyes scanning the crowd in search of the man whose reputation now hung beside Eleanor's in the air. And then the murmuring stopped. Alexander Hawthorne stepped forward from the far side of the ballroom. His tall figure moved through the crowd with quiet authority until he stood beside Eleanor. The candlelight reflected faintly in his dark eyes, but his expression remained calm. Julian's smile sharpened. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "perhaps you would care to explain the circumstances yourself." For a moment the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Ashbourne's gaze moved across the watching crowd before settling on Julian Crawford. "You suggest," the Duke said evenly, "that Miss Whitmore's presence in my chamber was improper." "I merely repeat what others witnessed," Julian replied with practiced innocence. Ashbourne's voice remained steady. "Then allow me to clarify the matter." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded set of documents. "These," he said, "are records of Mr. Crawford's considerable gambling debts, accumulated over the past year." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Julian's confident expression faltered. Ashbourne continued calmly. "They also reveal his intention to settle those debts using the dowry he expected to receive upon marrying Miss Whitmore." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Julian's face flushed with fury. "You have no right." "I have every right," Ashbourne interrupted quietly, "to defend the truth." Then he turned toward Eleanor. Before the astonished eyes of London's most powerful families, the Duke of Ashbourne reached for her hand, and held it. "If society insists upon scandal," he said clearly, "then let it witness the truth." The room fell utterly silent as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, and asked the question that would change both their lives forever. The ballroom had never felt so silent. Hundreds of guests stood motionless beneath the blazing chandeliers, their whispers swallowed by the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. The Duke of Ashbourne still held Eleanor Whitmore's hand, his tall figure steady and composed, while the scandal Julian Crawford had attempted to unleash hovered in the air like smoke that refused to settle. Eleanor could feel the warmth of the Duke's gloved fingers around her own, firm yet respectful, a silent anchor in the storm of attention pressing against her. Julian Crawford's carefully polished confidence had cracked. His face, moments ago flushed with righteous accusation, now shifted uneasily as the murmurs of the crowd sharpened into something far less sympathetic. "You have twisted the truth," Julian said hoarsely, though the certainty had drained from his voice. Ashbourne regarded him with the same calm precision he might give a trivial inconvenience. "No," the Duke replied quietly. "I have simply placed it where it belongs." The words carried no anger, yet they struck with the force of a verdict. A gentleman near the edge of the crowd leaned toward another and murmured something that made several heads turn toward Julian with newly awakened suspicion. Reputation in London was fragile, but once broken, it rarely found repair. Julian's gaze darted across the watching faces. For the first time that evening he seemed to recognize the shift of power in the room. "You cannot seriously expect society to believe this ridiculous tale," he said sharply. Ashbourne's expression did not change. "I expect society to believe evidence," he replied. He lifted the folded documents slightly, the crisp parchment visible in the candlelight. "These accounts are signed by your creditors, Mr. Crawford. They describe debts of remarkable enthusiasm." A few gentlemen exchanged darkly amused glances. Julian took a step forward, his composure slipping further. "You presume far too much authority." "Authority," Ashbourne said softly, "is rarely a matter of presumption." The subtle reminder of his rank landed heavily among the crowd. Julian's breath quickened, but the room had already begun drifting away from him. Conversations ignited in small clusters, voices carrying fragments of disbelief and sharp curiosity. Gambling debts. A planned fortune. A ruined engagement. The narrative Julian had carefully cultivated for weeks unraveled with breathtaking speed. Eleanor watched it happen with a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The humiliation she had carried like a hidden wound was dissolving before the eyes of the very society that had fed upon it. But the Duke had not yet finished speaking. His attention shifted from Julian back to the gathered assembly. "I believe," he said clearly, "that Miss Whitmore has endured quite enough speculation." His voice was not raised, yet every word carried through the vast ballroom with quiet authority. She ended her engagement because she discovered the truth about Mr. Crawford's intentions. Rather than expose him publicly, she chose discretion. A murmur of admiration rippled among the listeners. Ashbourne continued. "Unfortunately, discretion is rarely rewarded." Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze turn gently toward her. "In this case," he said, "it has been mistaken for guilt." The silence deepened once more. Then, in a movement both deliberate and astonishingly natural, the Duke stepped closer to her. He lifted her hands slightly between them. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice quieter now yet somehow more powerful, "you have faced society's judgment with remarkable dignity." Eleanor's breath trembled in her chest. "I believe," he continued, "that such courage deserves more than whispers and doubt." The watching crowd leaned forward almost collectively. Even Julian Crawford seemed frozen by the unfolding moment. Ashbourne's dark eyes held Eleanor's with steady warmth. "And therefore," he said softly, "I find myself compelled to ask you a question." The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Eleanor felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between them. "You once ran into my chamber seeking refuge," he continued, the faintest hint of humor touching his voice. "It would seem only fair that I now offer you a more permanent one." A ripple of astonished laughter fluttered through the room before vanishing again. Ashbourne's gaze never left hers. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he said clearly, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question fell like a stone into still water. Shock surged through the assembly. Several ladies gasped openly. Gentlemen stared as though the chandeliers themselves had begun to speak. A duke proposing marriage in the center of a ballroom was extraordinary enough. Proposing to a woman who had been the subject of scandal only weeks before bordered on legend. Eleanor's thoughts spun wildly. She had expected Ashbourne to defend her reputation. She had never imagined he would stake his own upon it. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ashbourne waited patiently, his expression unchanged, as though the judgment of the entire aristocracy meant very little compared to the answer she might give. In his eyes Eleanor saw something she had not expected to find there. Not pity. Not gallantry. Respect. And beneath that, something deeper still. Hope. For weeks she had felt herself shrinking beneath the gaze of society, reduced to whispers and speculation. Yet this man had looked at her and seen something worth defending. Worth standing beside. Worth choosing. Her heartbeat slowed. The room, the whispers, the scandal that had haunted her, all of it seemed suddenly distant. There was only the man before her. "Yes," she said softly. The word carried further than she expected. A wave of astonished exclamations swept through the ballroom. Eleanor felt Ashbourne's hand tighten slightly around hers, the smallest expression of satisfaction crossing his composed features. He bowed over her hand with quiet elegance. "Then it would appear," he said calmly, "that society has gained a new duchess." Laughter and excited murmurs erupted around them, the shock transforming swiftly into fascination. London adored nothing more than a dramatic romance, and this one had unfolded with impeccable theatrical flair. Julian Crawford stood abandoned at the edge of the gathering, his anger dissolving into humiliation as guests turned their backs on him. His story had ended. Another had begun. Ashbourne turned toward Eleanor once more. "Are you quite certain?" he asked quietly, his voice meant only for her now. She met his gaze with newfound steadiness. "Yes," she replied. For the first time since she had met him, The Duke of Ashbourne smiled without restraint. It was not a grand smile, nor a triumphant one. It was something quieter. Something real. The orchestra, sensing the tension had transformed into celebration, began playing again. The familiar rhythm of a waltz filled the ballroom. Ashbourne offered Eleanor his arm. "May I claim the first dance of our future, Duchess?" Eleanor placed her hand upon his sleeve. "I believe," she said softly, "you already have." They stepped onto the floor together as the music swelled, the candlelight shimmering across the polished marble like 1,000 small stars. Around them the crowd parted, watching with eager fascination as the Duke and his newly promised bride began to dance. Yet beyond the spectacle, beyond the murmuring admiration of London society, something quieter had taken root between them. A trust born in a moment of refuge. A partnership forged in defiance of whispers. And as they turned gracefully beneath the glittering chandeliers, Eleanor realized that the door she had fled through in fear had not led to ruin after all. It had led to the man who would change the course of her life forever.